Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Amy Patterson and I'm the Deputy Chair for Scottish Financial Enterprise Young Professionals. And firstly, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to attend today's session, which is being hosted by Capco in conjunction with the Young Professionals Network. So following the success of the first session that we did together back in May, which centred on the future of business analysis, I'm pleased to welcome you all back to today's second session, which will focus on demystifying data analytics. I'm shortly going to hand off to Sarah O'Callaghan to give you an overview of Capco in Scotland in the session. But before that, for those of you who might be new to the network, I thought it would be good just to tell you a little bit more about SFE YP and some of the opportunities we've got available to our members. So working alongside our parent company, Scottish Financial Enterprise, the Young Professional Network's designed to champion and inspire young professionals in the industry. In essence, we connect the leaders of the future with the leaders of today in order to help them drive tangible change across the industry. So aligning with the post-COVID working environment, we operate a hybrid event strategy, inviting you to join us both virtually and also in person to learn about and discuss important topics. This also gives you the opportunity to grow your network and meet like-minded professionals. To support SFE in their strategy and objectives, we've got 4 main work streams. Those are skills and inclusion, changing customer needs, climate and the journey to net zero, and mental health and well-being. So alongside those networking events, we've got monthly speaker events giving you access to industry leaders, and we also publish monthly communications and blogs on topical issues. Into 2022, we've also launched a new Changing Customer Needs podcast, which is available to view on both Spotify and Apple. So no matter what it is that floats your boat, there really is something for everyone to get involved with. Anyway, that's enough about us for now, because clearly I can't talk very well this morning. I've had too much coffee. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sarah to get us started.
Great, thank you, Amy. And hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's Capco webinar, Data Analytics Demystified. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Jane and Amy and the SFE, of course, for having us today. As Amy mentioned, this is the second of our webinars with the young professionals, and we're absolutely delighted to be back once again. So I'm Sarah O'Callaghan. I'm a managing principal at Capco and part of the leadership team here in Scotland. I'm also the partnership sponsor from a Capco Scotland perspective, working closely with Stuart DL, who is our SFE Young Professionals lead at Capco. And I'll be moderating the session today, so you'll hear a little bit more from me later in the Q&A. But today you will have Alex McCollom, who's a senior consultant in our Scotland office and part of our data analytics practice in the UK. So he'll be delivering the session today, and I will leave him to introduce himself, but just let me say that you're in safe hands. The content is fantastic, and it will cover things like data, what it is, where did it come from, and I guess most importantly, where is it going? But also we'll talk about the data analytics framework and the life cycle as well. So before I hand you over to Alex, just a little bit about Capco for those of you that don't know us. So as we move on to the next slide, Capco are a global management and technology consultancy dedicated to financial services. We are very much in and around the tech and business change space in FS, and we do a lot of thought leadership within the industry. We've got over 6,000 people globally, approaching 2,000 now in the UK, and more relevantly to this group and to, I guess, the SFE, we have over 300 people in our Scotland office, and that number is rising. You'll see on the slide there that we've had pretty rapid growth in Capco Scotland over the past 7 years, so it's a very exciting time for us at Capco. And I guess just relevant to the topic today, we have a very strong data practice here in Scotland, which is part of our wider data and analytics practice UK-wide, which I mentioned Alex is obviously part of. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to him. And just to mention that today's session is being recorded. We're doing Q&A at the end, so you can use the Q&A functionality in Zoom as we go, and we will hope to address as many of your questions as we can at the end. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Sarah. And first off, welcome everyone. As mentioned earlier, I'm Alex McCollom. I'm a senior consultant here in Capco's data and analytics practice in Scotland. And I believe we have a poll question coming up. And I will quickly ask the panelists behind the scenes if there's something that I need to be doing to trigger that. There we go. Awesome. So this is just a quick poll to assess both where we're starting at as an audience, as well as what we're hoping to learn from today's session. And this is simply to help me gauge as we go into a certain level of detail on some of the later slides, how much I should stay at more of an introductory level, or maybe we're all data experts in Scotland who've yet to meet each other and we can have some more in-depth conversation. Awesome, and then I'll just see quickly if I'm able to see the results of that myself. There we are, awesome. So it looks like on the whole here, and I'm seeing just about half of us have some knowledge of data analytics. That's awesome. I believe myself might be the only one, or maybe we have one or two others who answered expert. That's awesome. We have a good number who might have just some more limited knowledge. Welcome. And it looks like we're really excited to learn about both the fundamentals as well as current trends within data analytics today, which fortunately we're going to be speaking a lot about. And then hopefully I'll see at the end here, we may be able to rerun that poll, but just with questions 3 and 4. Obviously the intent was to be able to have those just at the end, but it looks like there's a limited poll functionality in Zoom today. Awesome. So without further ado, data analytics demystified, as mentioned earlier. I'm a member of the Capco Scotland team here. Originally, I did grow up in Philadelphia, and I've worked with Capco clients in both North Carolina in the US, as well as now in Edinburgh for the last 4 years. And today we're going to be looking at data analytics. And Sarah gave a great sort of introductory look at what we'll be covering today. And where we start is looking at how we actually define data and data analytics. And this can be a little pedantic for some maybe, but I just want to sort of set the baseline that while most people colloquially are going to use analytics or analysis in almost the same sentence, there are some out there who may say that analysis is maybe referring more to what's happened historically. And so we're conducting analysis on historical data to explain why something happens when it already did. Whereas analytics, which is generally considered to be a bit more challenging solely because in that definition, you're tying it to predicting or anticipating what future events may be. And naturally, hindsight is 20/20. It's a lot easier to explain the past than predict the future. So that's just a slight distinction for some on analysis versus analytics. More generally, as we'll be discussing it today, we'll be referring to both. I just wanted to make everyone aware of that distinction. And then similarly, some of you may be coming here from a BA or business analysis background. So I just wanted to briefly touch on how business analytics, for those who aren't familiar, is going to be looking at more how do you enable change by defining needs, recommending solutions. That may be very familiar work for some of you. Whereas business data analytics is more about the specific insights you can extract from data and how do we better do that. One way you can do that, and just a framework to be aware of, this has existed as a little either flowchart or others may have seen it as a pyramid. This is the data information knowledge, or sometimes there's wisdom tacked on at the top of that metaphorical pyramid. And it's just to say that data really is just the raw initial elements or data points that then has some sort of thing done to it. It's collected, there's some initial analysis, we're now at information. And then from there, bits of information are combined, whether that's specific tables or insights from here with, say, public market data combined with some expertise of an individual married with information from a firm. That might become knowledge about a decision that should be made, or how do we take action on what we've actually collected and brought together. From there, and this is just sort of a good primer initially on sort of the landscape. There are traditionally 4 different types of analytics, depending on the complexity and achieving meaningful outcomes, and just how hard it is to actually do what each of the 4 categories describes. So if we look there, generally added value is just a question of how hard or rare is it to get a accurate outcome when conducting this type of analytics or analysis, which generally is more impressive or has more added value the more complex it becomes. Descriptive and diagnostic are going to match more with what I talked about with analysis or looking to the past. Descriptive is going to be that very basic, we have raw data, we need to understand what happened, sort of a very basic, oh, our sales actually went up last quarter. Great. Diagnostic is going to say our sales went up last quarter, and it's because we had more new customers in our local branches. Maybe it was 20% of it, but 80% was the new online platform that we just opened. And so that gets to start to explain why did something happen. If we move into predictive, thinking about starting to anticipate what may happen, that is where we might start to anticipate that if we opened an online presence in one country, then we might say there's a similar country by demographics, by our market profile that we interact with, and that if we open the online location in that other country as well and make that service available to our customers, it should perform similarly to this first one. That's a prediction. That gets into more predictive analytics, where you're starting to use larger data sets, some more statistical modeling in some cases, whether very basic linear regression or just trend analysis, to more complex approaches and limited machine learning, where you would start to make those predictions in a quantitative way. Prescriptive then gets to the question of what needs to happen. And so this is some of the better examples you may be familiar with in your daily life if you're a Spotify user and have playlists that Spotify just thinks might be something you're interested in, or a Netflix recommendation of, you've watched these 20 shows, we think you would love this one. That's where you get into the prescriptive action, where without human intervention, there's a program assessing and anticipating what the next step should be. And so that's all the way out there in the top right. Similarly, as I just discussed, most financial institutions today are going to be pretty darn good at both descriptive and diagnostic analysis and analytics. Some are starting to progress to the predictive bit, where they're starting to be able to predict and make good on some of those trends. And naturally, then you're going to have the Googles, the Netflix, the Spotifys, the Airbnbs, those who are investing in tech as the first priority for their firm and the reason for their existence. They're going to be the ones leading on the bleeding edge of that prescriptive capability today still. And this was true 5 years ago and is still largely the case today. I'll pause there very briefly. And we have a brainstorming session where I believe you'll be able to post in the chat here, or otherwise, I don't believe there's a way that something will pop up on screen and we'll be able to type it in. But if you're able to type in the chat, why might financial services firms invest in building or scaling their data analytics capabilities? I'll just pause for about 30 seconds here and see if we're able to get some good feedback.
Apologies, Alex. There is no chat function here. People can post things via the Q&A, but not chat.
No worries. Awesome. Then if we could just have 1 or 2 folks, if they're brave enough and we're able to enable that, go off mute and just chime in. And then we'll go on to the next slide.
Hi. I'll go first. I don't mind joining in. I think it might be to support a review of, for example, their customer or lending portfolios. So, for example, in the position that we're in just now with the deteriorating economic environment, they might want to start to look at what the future of the book will look like and any preventative measures that they might need to take to manage that strategy.
Definitely, great example. And there's a lot there in consumer and retail lending that where you could have your own data sets. You could be looking at maybe pulling in additional outside information, either from the industry, from regulators, from third parties that we'll talk about in a bit. It's a great example. I'll pause for maybe one or two more, and then in about 10 seconds, we'll move on here. We're all feeling a bit shy today. Awesome. So we'll plow right on ahead. That was a great example with consumer lending and looking at that sort of loan book and how to best analyze that. Some of the other reasons are ones that would overlap with that example as well. There are just some different themes that I've called out here on this slide. Naturally, in many cases, the need to keep growing profitably is going to be a big reason, especially for a fintech that needs to keep growing and scaling. To better identify new customers, to better identify why one product is succeeding when another is failing. So that's going to be very common, especially in my personal mind in the retail and insurance spaces, as well as to some degree wealth. Whereas in capital markets, in my mind, a lot of my own experience comes from knowing that in capital markets, there are a lot of regulations, there are a lot of capital levels that need to be monitored, risks that need to be accounted for. And so regulatory requirements on reporting, on how a bank runs its business, are going to often be a large leading driver of investment as well, simply because you could say, well, invest in that predictive function to be able to better predict how we grow a customer base this quarter or maybe next quarter. Regulators usually have a different timeline in mind, and so that usually gets priority from an investment standpoint. Social intelligence, this one has evolved over the years. A decade ago, this would have looked like starting to barely understand how to use Facebook data to better market to individuals. That has since become a full-blown multi-billion-dollar global industry. And there's essentially just different aspects of social intelligence where there are new platforms, newer media, the advent in the last about 4 years now of a more video-first social experience, and how do you extract useful information from those interactions as opposed to text or other forms of social media. That's been the only real evolution in the last couple of years in that space, but that's been a trend since the whole category was invented in the about 2005 range, 2010. Newer signals, this could refer to anything from specifically new inputs of data. So in manufacturing and other contexts, you would see 5G and different ways of transferring data back physically back and forth between different physical locations would be an important thing to be able to handle. There are newer data objects, newer coding languages, newer ways of structuring and receiving data and sending it back and forth, new payment standards for those in the payment space. And so all of those could be different types of newer signals or inputs that need to be interpreted. With an allusion there for those who have read the books on the subject about the signal versus noise. The fifth one here, I will briefly skip and then come back to, since that one I like to spend a little bit of time on. Technology is, again, just with the overlap with 5G or similar larger advancements in line with Moore's law, admittedly, in the cloud computing space, where computational cost is getting significantly cheaper per unit of data that you're able to analyze and process. Similarly, on the other side, coding languages are getting closer and closer to what we consider to be human language rather than ones and zeros or more complex COBOL or Fortran code. And so in that sense, you have competing interests that are going to keep evolving and changing the need to invest in, say, 5 years ago, everyone may have been looking at a Tableau dashboard. Maybe they're now looking at Power BI as a very basic example. But there are much more complex considerations there as well, such as a shift from having a sole cloud provider to multiple cloud providers to play them off each other for cost. And that all brings me, we've sort of orbited around it to the last one on this slide, data volume, velocity, and variety. There's often a fourth one added on to this, sometimes called veracity, or how truthful, how much truthfulness or trust do we have in the data. And those are known in some academic circles as the 4 V's related to data, essentially how much of the data exists, how fast is it moving. So there was certainly a difference between data that's updated once a day versus data that's streamed continuously from a financial market. How different is the data? How much variety is there to it? Is it all just basic interest rate data, or is there a lot of complexity going on? Or maybe it's unstructured contract data that we're trying to extract which counterparty signed it, or what the interest, whether the interest rate was LIBOR or another type of interest rate. That's certainly one that I know has been a common challenge for many banks over the last couple of years. So all of those are, at the end of the day, just different reasons out there why banks and other companies may be investing in scaling up their analytics functions today. With that being said, this brings us to how do you start to actually engage in data analytics once you've decided that either you're part of a team that's made that decision, or you yourself have just found this very interesting, want to start to apply more of this to your own world. And so we've come up at Capco with essentially just a little framework or an approach for how to logically break down the steps of the life cycle, or the life cycle of how you go about working with answering a data analytics question. And so if we look here, the 6 we'll be touching on today are around identifying questions, sourcing and preparing data, conducting analysis, evaluating results, and then figuring out what those insights are and the next steps are from that. With a brief item we'll touch on first about foundational data management that enables those other steps. I've also just called out on this slide, there are a couple other models and approaches out there that you'll see that also bring themselves as an approach to how to do data analytics. And this is just to help you understand roughly how those align against each other. One organization globally, but also has a UK presence, the International Institute of Business Analytics. They offer a business data analytics training. Their approach aligns pretty much the same to ours, with the distinction that we, at least within our data practice, of course, focus more on sourcing versus preparing the data being 2 different activities. Google or Alphabet approaches it similarly, where they're looking at, and they of course found a Solword version for each of them, but then had to add a sort of subheader to each of the steps to explain what it actually is. And then from there, the PPDAC model is just an acronym for the 5 steps you see there, where you have a problem, a plan, data, analysis, and a conclusion. And that's a more statistical approach that's been around since about 2001, 2002 from some researchers that's since been brought into schools and universities for teaching. They're all very similar if you see them, so hopefully if you see that one of these in the wild, you'll be able to relate it back to what you saw today. First and foremost, within any data or any organization that works with data at scale, whether that's number of people working with it, amount of data they're handling, or usually some combination of the 2, you're going to need a good foundational best practices. This could be the equivalent of if you're an athlete, you could be the most brilliant swimmer or runner or cyclist or footballer with some certain technical skills that you're very good at, and maybe 1 or 2 of these steps around their version of what did they do in their job as an athlete. But the foundational piece is the equivalent of eating well, getting enough rest, staying hydrated, sort of the base things that without, it's going to be very hard for you to succeed at any of the other steps. And so what I've done here, and we'll see this framework over the next couple ones, is I've broken down just some sample activities that someone might engage in within, if they're working within this portion of the life cycle, as well as some things to be aware of, either skills, frameworks, technologies that I'll touch on to varying degrees of depth as we go. Within foundational data management, you'll often, in larger, most mature organizations, have a chief data officer or a CDO, chief data office. There may be slightly different names at different organizations for that. Essentially, it's just the central org, usually at a group level, if there's multiple business lines, figuring out what the bank's data or other organizations' data strategy should be. How do we manage it? How do we set up the data model? So how do different types of data relate to each other, and all that architecture, sort of strategic work to enable everyone else's success. That's all foundational data management work. If you're within a line of business in a mature org, so say you're within a team within markets, working on a trade desk, or maybe you're off researching something in a risk function, or you're in a branch helping originate new loans, you may, depending on your own experience and how you align within that part of the world, you may be helping liaise with those central data office teams when there's new analyses that need to be done, or a change to a data set needs to be made, or you think, oh, we need to start collecting these things because either a regulation requires it or there's a question we might need to ask. So it would be common to work with a central data team if you needed that availability in the central trusted sources of data. And then if you're a more maturing org, you may also then actually get to support this central data office more directly, where they may not have the full team or capability to, or it may not be the right design for the way the organization runs to support, and you'll actually be going and supporting that central team with some of those foundational activities. So maybe you're going to be the expert on this type of data maybe in loan contracts, to use, I believe it was Amy's example from earlier, because you're the expert on how loan data is stored and collected by the bank. You know how each field was collected and why over the years. Maybe there's a couple hundred of them now. You're one of the few people that can cut through all of the mess that's maybe built up over the years as they've slowly moved towards organizing and managing that more centrally. And so that's where you could be directly engaging, despite being in a bit removed from a central team. You could be doing some of these same data management best practices yourself in support of that. Some things I've touched on briefly above, but I've called out below to remind myself to touch on them all. Master data management and metadata. So how do you have good trusted sources of data, data dictionaries? How do you then, similarly, as I jump to the next one, govern and control to make sure that the data is good quality, everyone can trust it, agree on where it came from and hopefully what it means, as well as understand, by understanding where it came from, you have a visibility of what we call the lineage. We collected it here, we did this transformation, we summed this up here, and that's how it's now in this report or table. Governance also, as I mentioned, will relate to data quality monitoring. So both from a data perspective, do we just have good data? We don't have blanks accidentally where there shouldn't be in a data set. And then from a business standpoint as well, where there might be a business rule where we always need this field to be one of these three values over here that's important for how we operate. And so you can have both data and business defined rules on defining what good data quality looks like. Once you move out of the foundational piece, though, there's probably questions that will come up with at sort of the start of any data analytics lifecycle, where you're going to want to answer a certain question about either how do we grow this part of the business better, how do we better comply with this regulation, and we need to understand what our data looks like today, and if we're even close to being able to create the document for that compliance requirement. Maybe we're looking to better understand how to move market data back in between this table and this table faster or more efficiently, with maybe 2 extra data points brought in from somewhere else, and we want to understand if we're able to do that. Whatever the challenge may be, that's all figured out and documented and defined in this initial section where you're identifying what the questions are that you're trying to answer. Or if you're in the consulting world, you might hear the phrase scope very often. And this is important because often the individuals working with some of those later steps might be more time limited, or might be more stretched more thinly by the business if it's not something that you're able to do yourself and prioritize as part of taking it through the whole cycle yourself. So sometimes defining what that initial scope and interest is of what you're trying to answer can be very valuable for making sure that you're focused on the right things as you go through the later steps. And just some sample skills that or things that you might use in this first step might look like doing stakeholder interviews to understand if you're working with individuals from different parts of the bank to collect the initial data, who manages those data sets? What do you need to know about them in advance? Maybe you need to gather requirements, or if you're working in an agile team, write some user stories on what you think the work will be, to figure out how long it will take. Maybe you need to understand if you're figuring out how to better design a dashboard to answer a report, also doing some user journey mapping to understand maybe why it's painful for someone to answer that question with a report today. From there, once you know what you're trying to answer, you'll move into how do we source the data? And some of that I mentioned, there's going to be some overlap between each of these categories a little bit, where in those interviews, in those discussions, you might start to identify those sources of data. From there, you'll ideally be able to interpret some basic system or data architecture diagrams if they exist, or be able to draw very basic ones. If they do not, to just understand this table connects to this table, and here's how we connect them. And you may review what we call ontologies or data dictionaries to determine which data might be required. Those are just different ways of defining what does this field mean, how is it connected to other fields, and what information is it representing, and how should I use it, are different questions that might be answered by referring to something like a data dictionary. As we're sourcing the data, being able to interpret, as I mentioned, those system data architecture diagrams. Some of them we call conceptual or logical entity diagrams. And the more conceptual ones are, as it sounds, very just basic, where we have maybe data about a customer, we have data about their loans, and we need to connect those two. Whereas the logical one would then go a step further and say, and here's the little field here in this table that represents a unique record, and here's where that's stored similarly for every loan, so we can pull that information together. So the logical is just that step beyond, or it gets a little more technical, and is something that someone on maybe, say, the IT or tech side of a business might feel a bit more comfortable interpreting. Similarly, there's going to be, if it's a larger analysis exercise with many people involved, you'll have all your usual risk, issue, or dependency management. If you're mapping out what a process itself might look like, for maybe you need to be able to reproduce the analysis you're doing as well. So that's where being able to process map and document things in Visio or similar tools might be useful. And again, you may be realizing as you're sourcing the data that you're inevitably helping the foundational data management team document a new data source you discovered that they weren't aware of, or improve information that you reviewed and realized wasn't as up to date as you would like. From here, we move into how we actually prepare the data. And this is looking at how we actually do the transformations we need to take the raw data that we received from whatever those sources were and get it ready to the point where we can start conducting analysis on it. And so that might just be some basic transformations required. Maybe we need to anonymize the data that we're accessing if it's not already anonymized because of GDPR, or in the US, the CCCPA is a California Consumer Protection Act that similarly protects data, or maybe there's different regulations in another jurisdiction that would call for something similar. There could also just be more basic ones where, say, all the dates are coming out as a text format, and in your tool that you're interacting with, whether it's a dashboard is where you'll make some things and do your data analysis there, or maybe it's in Excel or wherever it is, you might just need to do some basic transformations to make your data usable. And similarly, this is the area where collection, ingestion, and a lot of what I just mentioned will be considered pre-processing, where you're always going to be doing the same consistent thing to the data, but it's not what's going to it's going to help you answer the question, but it's not the actual act of answering the question itself. It's just getting the data clean and usable, which in some cases it comes to you that way, and the step takes 2 seconds to verify that. Other times it can be much more complex depending on the state of the data you're working with. From there, we get to what for many may be the most fun part, where you actually get to conduct the analysis, figure out what's going on, try to answer that question. And this looks like actually running that final step of analysis to say, okay, here's the correlation of this to this. Here's the pattern of how often when this value is this in this field, maybe this is this over here. Starting to draw connections, figuring out the best ways to summarize data. And that may be something that you're doing yourself, or you may be, if you have less experience, working with some people with more data analytical experience, and you're the one helping guide them as the person who's maybe more expert on what the question is that we're trying to solve. or you might have good familiarity with the business background for why the data is collected, but someone else just happens to be much better at the specific. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, say there's a new location piece of data that's being incorporated into the analysis. It's not something you've had experience with yet. Someone else may come in because they have a lot of, say, Tableau or Power BI experience working with that type of data, and they're able to help you there. I've touched on some of the sample activities there. In many cases, as I mentioned, this is where you're actually analyzing the outputs of different correlations and different models. So if it's closer to statistical analysis and machine learning, that could be where understanding those statistical concepts and which approach or approaches should be taken can be very beneficial. Some comfort using analysis tools is definitely useful here, whether it be as basic as an Excel spreadsheet to SQL to more advanced analytics platforms or coding languages. That could all come into play in this step. And this is where you'd also begin to interpret the results of the analysis. But then we treat it as a separate next step where once you have a general sense of the direction of what the results are of the analysis, you start to evaluate and interpret, well, what does that mean? And how do we best summarize that up for people who have been removed from the in the weeds portions? Because you may have uncovered, if you're anything like me, 7 different very interesting things about the data, but maybe 2 of them are actually relevant for answering that original question you'd identified and then helping other stakeholders who may have an interest but weren't engaged in the analysis, help give them enough information so that they can help you make an informed decision on what should come next. And so here, this is where, as we're evaluating, you may be focused more on actually visualizing what you discovered, whether that be in Tableau, ClickView, Power BI, other visualization tools for reporting. Having some comfort translating technical findings into business outcomes is very valuable if you're someone working in this step, and this is where we often do see the individuals conducting the analysis or writing the code to run the statistical model. Those individuals are often in more mature orgs, a different person with a different skill set than the person engaging in this piece here, where they're evaluating the results, taking those outputs, maybe working with the more technical individual who, if it was something where they had to write code to do the analysis, to get the output they need to then summarize it nicely in a dashboard, tell the right story on a slide, whatever the case may be. And so this is more about taking that technical work and communicating it well. And if it's communicated well, hopefully, that means that we're then able to determine if it's really impactful insights. Often it may also be additional questions that need to be answered. And so this could be very simply just confirming that the original question actually was addressed, either through an answer or next steps, or through additional questions and next steps, where you would repeat the process again. And this is really about just communicating well up to key stakeholders, senior leadership, people who are far removed from the actual analysis, but probably have at least a financial budget and cost interest, if not a benefits them as well outcome, where they'll be interested in the output and you need to communicate those results up to those senior leaders. I will pause there. I believe we've come to the end of a top-level overview of the data analytics lifecycle. I hope this has been engaging and interesting for many of you, and hopefully it sparked some questions for the Q&A coming up shortly. But before we get to that, I just wanted to briefly pause and call out some areas. If you're wondering, maybe one of those steps in the process sounded like something you already do and want to learn more about in a more formal sense, or maybe you have no experience but would love just a more general exposure to the thinking that I touched on briefly today. Almost every slide I could dive into for another 5 to 15 minutes at minimum, just talking about different areas within it, considerations, specific use cases or examples or approaches. So if any of those you would love to learn more about yourself outside of today, this slide just briefly calls out, we have a couple different more formal certifications. The IABA one, which aligns to the framework we mentioned, they do their own certificate in business data analytics. Google and Microsoft also offer different ones. Google is also comprehensive. Microsoft is focused more on Power BI, so that how do we do some of the analysis, evaluate results, and communicate that well. That's where that one would be more focused. And then none of these are formal endorsements, of course, but just ones that in my experience have been useful, such as Coursera, Udemy, DataCamp are really good online providers. Tableau and Power BI both offer both software and training in their software. If you're interested in data analysis and visualization, if data modeling, lineage, and how you actually conduct that pre-processing and preparation of data, if that's something that sounds interesting to you, Alteryx is one of the leading offers in that space, although there are many across the board. And if mapping out processes is interesting, there are similarly, Visio is of course a more common entry-level one with it's more, you can start with a blank slate and go from there. Or if you're a larger organization, Celonis is another one that in our experience seems to work well. In your current role, you could also, of course, identify other independent trainings. Many of you will be at medium to larger companies that will have their own in-house trainings that might be available on this topic already. There may be someone else on this call in your firm, in the industry that you can reach out to as a mentor. And there's also, of course, the ability to look up future webinars on this subject from the SFE, from Capco. We do have data analytics articles in one of our publications. And there's, of course, a plethora I could comment on beyond that on LinkedIn, online, elsewhere, where you're able to seek out and find some really good information from some really great content producers as well. With that being said, I believe since we had the quiz already, unless there's a way to run the poll again, here we are. So if you just select whatever you'd like for the first two questions, I believe we can take the results from the first one and use that for the first two. And oh, here we go. Yes, sorry, I'm reading. It's already been modified. So just answering that one question there. Awesome. Hopefully that didn't take too long for everyone. Thank you all so much for that. I'm not sure if we're going to be running the fourth question as well. But again, that's just to gauge some idea of, based on today's initial primer discussion on data analytics, where you might want to pursue some more information. And maybe that means some more programming from the SFE on this subject. Maybe it means figuring out where you can best apply that in your world, or some of the other options on the slide. So I'll just pause for 10 to 15 seconds and then we'll keep going. Perfect. And so thank you all so much for bearing with me. I know there was a long section of just me talking, which I am very happy to bring to a close here and welcome Sarah back to run the Q&A portion coming up.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and well done. That was a long stint, as you said, so I'm sure your voice could do with a break. So I guess just to mention, there have been a few questions in the Q&A asking if the slides will be shared, and yes, they will. So we'll be sharing a copy of the slides and also the sessions being recorded, so that recording will also be shared with the SFE soon after the session. So rest assured, yeah, you will be able to see the slides. So I guess we've had, before we get into the questions, we've had quite a few questions, 4 or 5 questions. And just to say to anyone, you know, if you do have any other questions, if any of these questions spark a question that you may have, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We've got, you know, 10-ish minutes to get through questions, so do feel free to put as many questions in there as you want. And if we don't get through all of them and we don't cover everything, then we can follow up after that as well. But Alex, the first one I think I'll touch on just because the one or two previous slides towards the end, you mentioned, you know, what next, and you spoke about specific qualifications, etc., that can be done. And there was a question in there prior to that slide, but it's maybe something you can elaborate on a little bit more. So the question is, which data analytics qualifications are preferred in financial services, and which ones would you recommend? And what is the cost or commitment to them? So I guess from what you said previously, any particular things you would recommend even as a first step? And if you can talk on commitment maybe to any of these qualifications, would probably be useful for the listeners.
For sure, definitely. And so I think it depends on sort of first thinking about what step or steps within that life cycle you're most interested in as an individual, and especially if you're in a smaller organization, or that's where you'll find greater opportunity to engage in everything and probably run that whole cycle for yourself. Whereas in larger organizations, and this is maybe a pro or con for different individuals and their interests, you could see some people being interested in, I want to just be really good at dashboarding and visualization and making that story be communicated really well. Or I might want to do nothing but source and prepare and manage data, or I want to be a data lineage expert even, and be really narrow and focused within a larger org. And so depending on where in the cycle you're looking to engage, there could be different trainings that would be more applicable. I would say for anyone with any interest in the dashboarding and the storytelling component, having, if you don't already, a basic exposure to either the Tableau or the Power BI trainings that are offered in free, and don't take that much time to do, would be a great place to start. On the more technical side, I would say my personal preference is Data Camp. Out of the paid offerings out there, I think that they give a great offering for, they always claim it's about like 300 USD, but they always have a sale where it's half of that for a whole year. And the library and the level of engagement that you can get, where I personally find it valuable to be able to code within the actual web interface where you're learning the lesson, and have that instant feedback on what's right, why did you do this? That's just my personal preference. Some people prefer a more online MOOC structure, and their Coursera and Udemy have many that may cost some money, or may be free, but then it costs money to get a certification. And those are nice if you want to be able to have the chance to study, take the full course, and then decide if you want to get the actual certification. The only other one I'd briefly call out is if you're looking to, you know that you'll be working with cloud-based data, or your company is moving in that direction for how you would start to answer these questions instead of working in Excel files, as many of us probably still do. All of the three main web providers, Microsoft Azure, Google's Google Cloud Platform, as well as AWS, all have their own extensive certification lists, specifically for those who want to become cloud engineers or cloud architects, and similar, very reputable certifications, but those are the largest time commitment out of the bunch I've mentioned for sure.
Brilliant, Alex. That was really comprehensive and detailed. So hopefully that answers the question well. There was actually another question on what tools are best to practice for data analytics. And you've obviously mentioned, again, Tableau and Power BI. Previously, you mentioned Celonis. Is there anything else to add, I guess, for maybe, again, someone starting out in data? What are the best specific tools to focus on? Maybe it is Tableau, maybe it is Power BI.
For sure. I would say, and this will be counterintuitive for some, if you're not comfortable with Excel at all, but it's just I've been afraid of it. I've avoided it like the plague whenever I can avoid it in my professional career. Having a basic level of comfort with understanding the very basic things in Excel are going to be very similar elsewhere. And that is because of 25 plus years now, there's a lot of material out there on how to do things. So I would say some very basic Excel, at least be comfortable doing a VLOOKUP, right? If you're not there already, understanding why that works between joining tables, some very basic SQL would also be good as well. I could give a 2-minute lesson to everyone to write their first SQL command. It's that easy.
How funny, Alex, literally as you were speaking,
Yeah.
a question came in saying, how do we build confidence to not rely so heavily on Excel?
And that is a great, possibly much more in-depth question. I could spend, for those who drink, a drink or two at a happy, if this were at 5 p.m. in an office with a happy hour afterwards, discussing that question. For many larger organizations, it is a question often of, even if they have the good models and the trusted data sources, there's still that need for what I call last mile analytics. So in a supply chain where you're moving things to a grocery store, it's often first coming into a larger network. There's a warehouse, maybe a sub warehouse, however the company or the UPS enabled, I used an American company there, DPD enabled. Shipping companies, they still need to, someone has to go and physically deliver it to your address. And it's just the same with data, where that last mile of, we got the initial data, there needs to be something done to it on that last step, and then it can be consumed for whatever decision we need to make. That's where a lot of Excel use still comes from, in my experience. And it's a question of either some pretty expensive, if you're a massive organization, tools that you can at least start to explore with free licenses. Or it's, but it really just comes down to to what degree a company is able and willing to invest in the foundational data management bits I mentioned, that you can slowly start to move away from Excel at all.
Okay, I'm going to flip a little bit. There's some questions about Capco, which I'll touch on, but I guess just a bit more on you. There's a question about, how did you get involved in data analytics, and what has your journey been like? That could be an answer. Again, you could talk probably for a long time, but in summary.
I'll be succinct. Essentially, I've always had a head for numbers, enjoyed that. I realized in my first less than 6 months with Capco, and a little before that in prior internships, I hated the data bits less than everyone else, and kind of enjoyed it as I got better at the technical skills and built that confidence. And that slowly grew and evolved into the place I am now, where we're all on here from a young professional standpoint, right? Only a couple years removed from university now. I had a business degree and I'm now working as a data professional, still for business, right? But I was able to make that pivot just through self-study and interest. But it is a journey, and it takes a little bit of time, depending on your own personal confidence level, just to get to that level of comfort where you feel, I'm good at this.
Brilliant. I think a lot of people can probably relate to that. I think people, and I can speak for myself, not being a data specialist, but when I first started my career, data scared me. You know, the word data, and, you know, not being a specialist, it does scare people off. So it's nice to hear that, you know, you weren't necessarily going down that route, but then decided, you know, it's something you were interested in. So I think it is great to see that, you know, if you don't necessarily think you have a flair for it, or it may not be something you're interested in, it's always possible through, you know, a lot of self-discovery and, you know, online reading can actually learn to a data career. So yeah, that's great. Hopefully people found that interesting. So there's one here on, and I might tweak it a little bit, but it says, can you share any key success stories where Capco has provided data analytics services to clients? But I might just tweak it a little bit, Alex, to make it a bit more personal, and maybe talk to, you know, particular experience you've had yourself, or a project that you've been on yourself where, you know, you have provided, you know, that data analytics service, or your team. Yeah,
exactly. And so this was one where we essentially were brought in by a bank in the US. If you're familiar with the concept of deposit insurance, when I heard that coming out fresh out of uni, I was like, massive project for a long time about deposit insurance. But what it essentially became was an exercise. If a bank was to fail, there's in the US 14 different categories of bank account that each get a different treatment on how their deposits are insured. And the regulation came along that said the government agency is not going to do this if you're a massive enough bank. You have to do this for yourself and build a calculation program that will accurately calculate it for all of your bank's accounts in less than 24 hours. from the point that someone somewhere in an office decided the bank has failed and can't honor its debts and obligations. And so that became a fun challenge by the end of figuring out how can we actually help build that for them, show the regulators that they're able to attest and run this whole thing. And it was a great exposure to just the end-to-end, sort of the government provided the requirements in that case, as opposed to yourself collaboratively with others in building an entire system designed to do data analytics, ultimately.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex, for sharing. We have had a few more questions, but unfortunately, we'll run out of time if we keep going. We did get through most of them. And if there is anything burning, please let us know and we can get back to you through SFE later. But with that, just to say thank you, Alex, for your time and sharing your experiences and expertise. And if anyone does want to get in touch with either of us, please reach out. The details are on the screen. And finally, just to say a huge thank you again to the SFE Young Professionals. And thank you to Jade and Amy for organising and having us today. And with that, I will hand back to Amy.
Thank you, Sarah, and also thank you, Alex, for what was a really engaging and informative session. I'm actually currently recruiting for someone that I need a very analytical skill set for, and having joined the session today, I've definitely got a much better understanding of what it takes than I did this morning. So I'm sure that there were many other valuable takeaways for our members as well, and it was great to see so much interaction through the polls, the brainstorm and the Q&A. So just briefly, I mentioned the vast variety of events and communications that the YP network bring to our members at the start of the call, and I wanted to highlight a couple that we have coming up. So on Thursday this week, the 13th of October, we would be delighted if you could join us at Morgan Stanley offices in Glasgow for our Young Professionals Autumn Reception. You're going to hear from some of our YP and SFE board and committee members about their experiences with SFE and how that's helped them in their career. And following on from that, you'll get the chance to enjoy some drinks and canopies whilst you network with other like-minded professionals and senior leaders. Following on from that, on Tuesday the 25th of October, we're going to be hosting the next event in our Young Professional SFE Board Leadership Series. So if you can join us for that webinar, we're going to have Louisa Knox, who's a partner at Shepherd and Wedderburn and is also their board sponsor for the firm's journey to net zero by 2030. That session will focus on the role that leadership plays in driving positive change in that journey to net zero. It'll be facilitated also by Sarah Holmes, who's on our YP committee. So the sign up for these events, as well as the communications, blogs and podcasts that I've mentioned previously, can all be accessed through our new interactive member platform. So I'd encourage you to get on the website and sign up for that as soon as possible and take advantage of some of the opportunities that are available just at the click of a button. So with that being said, I'll hopefully see some of you soon in person at one of our in-person events or in a number of the other online events that we have coming up. So thank you very much to everyone today at Capco and YP and everyone for attending, and I think we can close the call there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.